Hello, everyone. I'm Theron Muller from the Waseda University Faculty of Human Sciences. Thank you very much for joining our session today, where we're going to be talking about translanguaging in the Japanese research context, specifically examining some findings from some collaborative autoethnographies that John and I have done. John?
I'm John Adamson from the University of Niigata Prefecture in Japan.
And if you'd like to access our slides, if you scan that QR code that's there on the screen, you should be able to access our slides there on Google Slide Deck, which should be freely accessible to anybody with the link. And then back over to you, John.
As an introduction then, clearly then we're talking about translanguaging, the use of L1, L2, or mixed in together. And we're focusing basically primarily on different sort of aspects of it. The first one is Japanese in the tertiary sector, which Theron and I have researched quite a lot before. We're looking at the teaching and how translanguaging is used in the classroom, especially in TESOL, the English language classroom, and interesting nowadays, the increasing EMI, English medium instruction, where people who are based in Japan are actually taking content studies in English. And that also includes the dissertation preparation process, where people are writing the final year, dissertation. We're also looking at the idea of translanguaging in workplace practices and research. So not necessarily in the classroom, but outside as well, generally. Over to you, Theron.
And the methods that we're going to be discussing today involve collaborative autoethnography, which is a relatively recent method, but it's been gaining popularity. And some of the motivations for using collaborative autoethnography is that it helps to front what otherwise would have been marginalized identities and languages. So it makes a space for those otherwise marginalized voices to be able to come to the fore. We've also used collaborative autoethnography to try to better understand the process of doing multilingual research. And there's been quite a bit of interest in bringing collaborative autoethnography into better understanding translanguaging in a pedagogical context, specifically surrounding the desire to try to decenter away from monolingual practices to embracing the use of multiple languages in the language classroom.
Okay, talking a little bit more in depth about collaborative autoethnography, as Theron said, it's a relatively new kind of term. Call it CAE. And Chang and a group of people did kind of groundbreaking research more than 10 years ago into it. And what it means is that it's a joint narrativization. So the researchers are giving their narrative in a group together. You can do it online, you can record it in different ways, but it's not just giving individual narratives and then just listening to it and moving on to the next narrative. It's interacting. It's like a conversation in which you are probing each other, you're challenging each other, asking for more explanations, and that helps to, give a better account because you are being listened to actively by the other researcher participants. It comes under the broad umbrella of ethnography. It's qualitative, it's longitudinal, it's potentially very transformative because, talking about your narratives in a group makes you consider other perspectives and you can actually transform your beliefs. One of the big objectives of CAE is that it builds community. People come together with a shared issue or problem, either social or educational, and it builds a very, very supportive community. In contrast to the typical autoethnographic account, the solo narrative that you often read about, there's nothing wrong with that, but it kind of challenges the self-centeredness of that and moves it away from just giving your own account into sharing it with others and maybe, having to change your account because during the process, you realize something different, Over to you, Theron.
All right. So, because of the limited time that we have today, what we wanted to do was try to dive into some actual findings from some of the collaborative autoethnographies that we've worked on in the past. And the way that John and I have tended to approach collaborative autoethnographic investigations is to first generate a text that's focused around some frames that concern the topic of research that we're working on. And then after we've generated that initial text, which involves us sharing our thoughts on each of the frames and then questioning and responding, then we start to use some textual analysis tools to try to draw out some insights from those texts. And so we've got two kind of vignettes to share with you in our presentation today. One is from a investigation that we did into our multilingual research practice for a book chapter that's forthcoming. And then the second one is for another forthcoming book chapter that I did together with my research assistant, Ala Salem. And so you can see the data collection period for the first one was the end of 2018 into the beginning of 2019. And the data collection period for the second one was the end of 2023 into the beginning of 2024. And just to give you some context around the total amount of data that was generated, both were a little bit longer. The original CAE text was a little bit longer than 6,000 words. And then that's what we used for analysis to eventually come up with findings that we shared in those forthcoming book chapters, and also these vignettes that we're going to share with you here today. Back over to you, John.
Looking at the first vignette then, it comes under this the title of Pedagogical Practices and Local Norms of Translanguaging. And let me just read quickly something that I gave in my narrative a few years ago. I adhere to a multilingual policy, as our language and content classes are not to prepare students for the academic norms of a Western university. In this sense, local norms of practice can be exercised. When our university first opened in 2009, we conducted research with Japanese EMI content teachers, which showed us they wanted students with not only English proficiency to the level where they could understand lectures and take part in seminars, but also Japanese academic skills intermixed with those English skills. Now, reflecting on this input from 2018, first of all, it showed that, in my tertiary case in Japan, we were attempting a decentering of monolingual pedagogy, and it was based on research. And because the Japanese teacher said it's not going to be just English, we want them to have Japanese and English skills mixed together. So this really showed that we were trying to move from this exclusion of monolingualism, English only, to inclusion, like translanguaging, using Japanese and English skills together. Although we must remember, those aren't binary categories. It's not monolingual or translanguaging. Things can happen on a continuum in between. Now, looking at some of the research that this kind of links into, what we were trying to do is to recognize the students' biliteracy competences. That particularly comes from the work of Block. But the problem is then that outside of the classroom, in institutional discourse, there's really an expectation that monolingual Japanese only is used. So there's a kind of contrast between the classroom and outside of the classroom. Over to you, Theron.
Okay, so the next vignette that we wanted to share is from my experience of having acquired a grant funded by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, which is a government-supported institution. And as I was going through the grant application process, all of that was in English, but then after my grant was approved, I needed to get institutional review board approval to proceed with the research. And then when I put in my initial application for that, while the forms were all in Japanese, I thought because my grant application had been in English, I could take the important points from the English grant application, put them into the Japanese IRB form, and then I'd be good to go. But instead, what happened was the institution got back to me and said, no, the requirement is that you need to submit all of the IRB documents in Japanese. So let me jump into the actual CAE text that I wrote. So after I received my Kaken grant, the first step was to apply for human research ethics approval through the University of Toyama. As my grant application was in English, the initial documents I submitted used the English from my grant application in the Japanese form. However, the ethics review office said that the forms needed to be submitted in Japanese. And so reflecting on this experience, you can see that while the institutional language policy is promoting writing and publishing in English, encouraging people to publish more international publications, the requirement underlying that kind of broader public-facing policy is that the paperwork that you need to do in order to be able to do the research has to be submitted in Japanese. And that has some resonance with other research that talks about the lack of coherence in language policy structures, particularly in educational settings like universities. So I think it's back to you, John.
Yeah, kind of moving on to a synthesis of what we've said today. The first point is kind of referring to the work of Block in 2018, who talked about the recognition of students and the local L1 in the L2 classroom, either for language or content study. And so that great things can happen there. They can be recognized. But when you move outside, that kind of those language rights are not redistributed at the institutional level. So there's a gap between classroom recognition to non-recognition or non-redistribution outside of it at the institutional level.
And then the other insight that we wanted to pull out kind of connects to the fact that many language policies are largely implicit. And so as in my IRB application, it's only when you're not following the expected norms that you have those implicit policies are made explicit to you. And that can lead to experiences of exclusion, particularly for multilingual faculty. And then related to that, well, my vignette talks about how Japanese ended up being more important than English as far as the institution was concerned for the IRB process. Another finding from AILA and my forthcoming book chapter is that these findings really are kind of lack coherence, as I mentioned previously. And so it isn't that Japanese always ends up trumping English, but it's kind of very locally dependent on what very particular expectations are, which language is expected. And it's only when you need to do the application that you submit something that's wrong, and then you hear back, no, this is wrong, it needs to be in this language, or it needs to be in that language. And so finally, this is our last slide. And because this is a forum format, and because of the very limited time we had to share our insights, what we thought was we wanted to open up to the floor and try to invite some discussion of some of the issues that we've shared here, in the hopes that some of our experiences may resonate with your own personal experiences in terms of pedagogy and research practice. And so in order to try to incite some discussion, these are the questions we wanted to ask. What are your experiences of in or exclusion in your research? How institutionally specific are these experiences? And to what extent are they framed by other types of boundaries? To what extent are institutional language policies implicit or explicit in your experience? And then how does this lead to experiences of in or exclusion? And that was our final slide. Next is our references. And thank you very much for your time and attention. And we'll look forward to hopefully coming back to some of the issues we've discussed when we get to the question time at the end of the session. John, any final words?
No, we look forward to any comments and discussion later.
All right. Thank you very much.